My name is Barbara Menna, and I'm the Interim Director of the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere at UF. So the interactive talk today is part of a grant that we received at the center in the University of Florida by the Mellon Foundation, and that we administer, and it's called Intersections, Animating Conversation with the Humanities, and it gives grants to faculty members to think about a grand challenge question that then will turn into a course for undergrads. So it's this link between research and teaching, and between the university and the community that led us to invite Libby Roderick to UF, and then to Gainesville to think with us about difficult dialogues. But I will hand over the microphone to the mayor of Gainesville, Lauren Poe, who earned his BA in History and Master of Education in Secondary Social Sciences from the University of Florida. And he will provide a short welcome before I introduce the speaker, Libby Roderick.
Thank you. There we go. Well, it's my pleasure and honor to be here to greet you all today, and especially to greet our special guest, Libby Roderick. The title, Meaningful Dialogue in Difficult Times, seems so prescient today, and we seem so much in need of guidance in how do we have productive and constructive conversations with one another when we disagree about so much. And I feel like there's a ethos out there right now that things are as bad or worse than they've ever been, and we have a sense of sort of dread, and are we ever going to make it through this? And it harkened me back to the beginning of our nation as we know it today under the U.S. Constitution, and the fights that took place as that process moved along. And so there are two fellows that you probably know, Thomas Jefferson, I call him TJ because we're very familiar with one another, and John Adams. And they spent much of their early lives as best friends, and then they became horrible frenemies for the period of time when they were in elected office. And then after they both retired, they became the closest of friends until they died, and corresponded almost daily. But I wanted to read some excerpts from the campaign of 1800 when Jefferson and Adams ran against each other, and what they were saying, and remind you this is still the time when they considered themselves to be relatively friendly. So Thomas Jefferson accused Adams of importing his mistresses. I don't know if the insult was that he was importing them or that he was carrying mistresses in the first place. Nonetheless, that was quite the insult. And then he said, Adams is I'm sorry, I'm having trouble reading my own writing here. Adams is a hideous hermaphroditical character with neither the firmness of a man or the gentility and sensibility of a woman. This was during the campaign. This was campaign literature that went out to one of his best friends. Adams responded, if we elect Jefferson, we will see murder, robbery, rape, incest, and adultery be openly taught and practiced by our children. And then he accused Jefferson of being the son of a half-breed Indian squaw raised on hoe cakes. These are our founding fellows. These are the people that we deify and revere and put on pedestals and think they had some sort of insight that the rest of us could never comprehend. And I challenge you to find anything worse that was said in the election of 2016. It got bad, but it didn't get that bad. And somehow we made it through it and we progressed. And so we're so pleased that Libby Roderick is here to help us have these discussions. And she reminds me of a story that is often told in circles of people recovering from addiction. The story is that someone falls into a deep, dark hole, and they shout for help, and people walk by, and eventually someone comes along and he jumps down into the hole with him, and he says, "What are you you doing? Now we're both stuck down here, and he says, don't worry about it. I've been here before, and I know the way out. And I think that's what Ms. Roderick can help us with is how do we work our way out of this, both as a community and as ambassadors for positive dialogue as we tackle these difficult situations. And so I'm so pleased that she is here in Gainesville and working with our professors and the rest of our community. I'm so pleased you all are here because it shows a commitment that you have to positive dialogue and working through our differences in a mature, intelligent way. And I think that we'll all leave today better off for it. So with that, I'll invite our host back up to introduce our special guest of honor. Thank you all for being here today.
Okay, so Libby Roderick is the director of the Difficult Dialogues Initiative, and she's also the associate director of the Center for Advancing Faculty Excellence at the University of Alaska Anchorage and the vice chair of the Difficult Dialogues National Research Center. She's an associate editor of a book called Start Talking, a handbook for engaging difficult dialogues in higher education, and co-author of another book called Stop Talking: Indigenous Ways of Teaching and Learning and Difficult Dialogues in Higher Education. I also want to thank our center's associate director, Sophia Akerd, program coordinator, Maddie Collins, who's somewhere around here too, over there. If you want to sign up for our email so that you get our weekly emails for all of our events, you can do this over there. And we also have copies of the books that you can look at. And then I also want to thank Lauren Cox, who's also over there, if you have any questions. I also want to thank Assistant Director of the Public Library System, Chris Culp, for her collaboration, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for their financial support. And I'm supposed to say that there are emergency exits here, there, and the bathrooms are if you go out and around the elevator. So now also, just because we will practice a little bit today in difficult dialogues, you want to know that there are cameras here, but there will be no sound recording, and there's you only function as a background in a video about our grant. So please do not worry that anything that you will say will be recorded and go out to the public. But having said this, without further ado, please help me welcome Libby Roderick.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the mayor. I've heard wonderful things about you since I got here, which is really nice to hear. My father was mayor in my town when I grew up, and so I know what that means to people. Super glad to be here, super amazed that you would come inside in this kind of weather and do this with me. I'm from Alaska, and the idea that we'd all be in here right now and it's like that outside, I just don't completely understand, but that's all right. So I am very glad to be here. I think, as I've been telling folks, I've been getting multiple invitations a week from campuses to come and work with their particularly faculty on these issues, because as we all know, as the mayor mentioned, we are in an interesting time. History tells us it's not the only interesting time that this country has had in this way, but it is a particularly polarized moment, shall we say. And so learning how to engage in dialogue with folks with whom we disagree is absolutely critical in these moments for our democracy to function well, and for us to respect each other as we go forward. So we only have a short period of time today. I'm going to do what I do with the faculty, which is dive right into hands-on strategies, because that's the most important thing to me, is to give you some actual tools to take away. And some of you were with us at the university, and if so, I expect you to lead and model some of the things you learned, because I will be introducing similar strategies. So my goals today is just to share. We probably won't have time to practice some strategies, but share them for successfully and proactively introducing and engaging in difficult conversations, and then to think about ways you might apply them in your own context, right? So we'll dive right in. The first one, some of you I'm sure are familiar with. I call them listening or thinking pairs. And this is how I introduce them to faculty, or when I'm in a university context, which is to invite people to think about somebody that you wildly respect and admire. Okay? living or dead, male or female or other. Any? Could be your son, could be Martin Luther King, right? Could be Mother Teresa, could be a famous scientist, etc. Everybody got someone, I hope, okay? So what I'm gonna invite you to do next is partner up with somebody you do not know and listen to them and be listened to by them. And I am inviting you to listen with the same quality of attention that you would give to the person that is in your mind. So if it's Albert Einstein sitting across from you, I want you to give the same attention to this individual that you would give to him. And the reason is that increasingly it appears that the quality of our thinking is dependent upon the quality of the attention we give each other. People think better in the presence of a respectful other human being providing them attention. And if we listen to them with respect, their thinking rises to the occasion and you hear all kinds of interesting, authentic, and brilliant insights. And if we listen to them while we are tapping our toes and looking at our watches and texting other people, the quality of their thinking tends to drop. Okay? So please do your best to listen to your partner with that kind of deep respect and awareness that they are far more intelligent than they may always display or even remember. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to give you 2 minutes apiece. So it'll go like this. You know, if we were partners together, we would come together and figure out who wants to go first. And you'd say to me, you go first. I'd say, okay. And so for 2 minutes, she would just listen to me. She wouldn't interrupt. She wouldn't ask questions. She wouldn't comment, right? She would just relax, enjoy my intelligence, which will be different than hers, and give me the space to think out loud for 2 minutes. If I don't feel like talking for my 2 minutes, I don't have to. I come from a place where we have multiple indigenous nations, and it is very important for me to say that just because someone's not talking doesn't mean they're not thinking, right? So if the person wants to sit there in your company for 2 minutes, they can. If they want to talk about the fact that they left the stove on when they left the house today, and that's what really got their attention, they can, right? But for 2 minutes, your job is to listen with great relaxed pleasure and attention to another human being think or do whatever they choose to do for 2 minutes, okay? And so after your 2 minutes are up, or my 2 minutes are up, I will make a little sound up here to clue you into the fact that it's time to switch to the other person. And I would close up my thoughts, and then we would switch to you, and my job would be to listen that way to you for 2 minutes, okay? So any questions about that? This is as I say, deceptively simple exercise. I teach classes for 16 weeks on this exercise alone. And I'll just say on the way in that one of the things we're good at, tend to be good at least at universities, is teaching people how to speak, right? And teaching people how to think critically. That's one of our things that we are proudest of. But we almost never teach people how to listen. And in terms of dialogue and in terms of difficult issues and controversies around the world, I would say the missing ingredient is somebody listening and actually hearing what other people are saying. So building your skill at being able to listen is super important. And the other thing I'd invite you to do is pay attention to your nonverbals. Just start noticing how you tend to listen to people, right? Many, many people tend to listen with very active nonverbals, right? The most common one is continually nodding our heads to indicate that we agree with what the other person is saying and we approve of what they're doing, right? And that's great, except that in a difficult dialogue, if we were doing this exercise, somebody might begin saying something you really, really didn't agree with, and then you would stop nodding your head like that, and they would get the message, okay? So we're trying to learn a wee bit how to listen without leading. Okay? So just notice, that's all this time. So I'm going to ask you to do that, and you're invited to think about that question. Difficult conversations in your life, in your town, in your classes, wherever you find yourself, in your workplace, in your house, right? What are the difficult conversations that you're aware of in your own life? Okay, so that's your prompt. So if you don't find someone shortly, when I say go find someone, raise your hand and I will help you find someone so that we start. And as soon as you do find someone, just find a place to sit, decide who's going first, and somebody jump in. And then keep an ear out from the fact that I will be twirling around up here trying to get your attention after 2 minutes to suggest that you shift to the other person. Okay, any questions? Okay, ready, set, go. So you get a sense of it, right? And then there are a multitude of other ones, public and private. So what I wanted to do now is shift to the process of what it was like to do the exercise. Many times people do not actually do what I invited them to do, as I told the faculty yesterday. We're so used to engaging and socializing. You know, we're so used to a certain way of interacting with each other that it's hard for us to shift out of that habit when somebody gives you these new instructions, right? So many, many times I'll give these instructions and I'll look around and see many, many spirited discussions going on in the group, right? And that's fine, you know, that's what people default to, that's what we're used to. But I'm trying to teach something very specific for a very specific reason. As I mentioned earlier, fundamentally, we don't listen to each other. And that's a pretty radical reality. And the reason it matters, there's many, many reasons it matters, of course, but one of them is because people never change their position until they have first been heard. Or rarely, I should say, change their position. If they feel unheard about what they currently believe, or they do not then let that go and move to a new place, even when presented with evidence overwhelming that would perhaps lead them to that point, if they have never been heard for where they were in the first place, okay? So I am actually, there's a strategy behind this. There's a reason why I'm teaching you to do it the way I'm teaching you to do it, even though it goes against the grain. So for those of you who did manage to do something at least approximating what we were talking about, what was it like to listen to somebody for 2 minutes without interrupting and presumably leading too much and so forth, commenting? Yeah, please.
The thing I found most difficult was to not
Right.
affirm. So I guess my question is, how do you do that without the other person wondering, are you listening?
Right, sure. Yeah, I agree, and in most of the applications you would make of this, particularly in an unofficial capacity, right? It's going to be fine that you do that. But I'm talking now about difficult dialogues, and so I have been in positions where we're talking about very harrowing things, right? Where we really disagree with each other, and I am listening to somebody say something that appalls me. And I don't want people to become so unaware of what we're broadcasting. I think that, you know, whoever the academicians are in the room couldn't tell me, but some vast proportion of our communication is actually nonverbal, right? So people will pick up what you think about them when they say whatever they do. If you're used to broadcasting approval all the way down the path and then seriously not. Okay, so I'm not asking people to become robots. That doesn't work very well either for your person being listened to. But I'm asking us to become mindful of the reflexive ways, and I have it too. I have a reflexive way of affirming. But just to start to notice that, because then you have the choice. And if you're in a situation where what is called on is for you to listen without constantly commenting with your body, you can. Great point. Other thoughts about what it was like to listen to somebody else for 2 minutes without doing some of the things we're used to doing in conversation? Yeah, please.
I had a hard time not responding to, this, or
Yes.
just responding verbally to something she said. I was like, just listen to her.
Right, exactly. Most people the same, right? Again, our social cues are to keep the thing going, to ask questions. Frequently we say, oh, this happened to your aunt? You want to hear what happened to my grandmother? And all of a sudden they're left in the dust somewhere and we're off talking about our grandmother, right? That's a very common conversational strategy. So good for you, right, for noticing those polls. When I teach these classes, again, I've taught some people over a 35-year span about this particular strategy. That's where we start. Most people start and we just start noticing where the pull is to do all these other things that we're used to doing, right? And the more mindful you become, the more you can relax, and the more you get listened to by someone else, the less compelled you feel to do that, right? So I can just sit there. I've mentioned to people, I have people that I listen to for half an hour, and they listen to me for half an hour. And we're not rigid robots, but we're listening, and we're not commenting, and I don't feel any compulsion to weigh in, you know? I'm just giving them the space to find out what they think, really. I get to appreciate that as they sometimes actually start to think new things because finally somebody's shut up long enough to let them find what they think, right? So, great comment. Maybe one more person on what was it like to listen? Yeah.
So I listened to Maddie, whom I know but really never had a conversation, a real listening, I would say.
Yeah.
And I just found myself being empathetic, and just being here listening to her area of study and why it's so important to her, and has implications now. She was teaching me about the history of the origin of clans and how this is all happening now in society. And I was fascinated, but I could see the changes in her voice. In the beginning, she started to speak quickly, and then she appeared to relax, and her eyes actually changed and relaxed. And I could see some suffering in the back of her eyes, kind of.
All of ours, yes.
So, yeah.
Okay. Well, nice noticing, right? You're noticing all the, again, nonverbals and all that's going on in our communication. And let me invite people, what was it like to be listened to for 2 minutes? Because I don't know if that was your experience. She's observing you. It might be different for you. But for some people, they feel like, finally, I get 2 minutes, right? You know, I get to relax and actually not be interrupted. For the first time for some of us in a long time. So what was it like for any of you to be listened to for, if you were, for 2 minutes?
Strange.
Tell me.
Strange.
Yeah.
Because without knowing each other, we started a conversation, which was one-sided.
Yeah.
Now my partner here responded to the topic which I had started. So that is really then, in a way, a conversation.
Right.
Even though still monologue.
Right, exactly. Right. No, it's so different, isn't it? It's a different whole thing, and the concept is different. It's different than a conversation. I could spend my 2 minutes talking about the climate crisis, which is on my mind and heart 24 hours a day. She could talk about her young child and not reference anything I said at all. The point is to allow each person to think about and express whatever they need to. So it's actually not a conversation, which makes it feel odd in many ways, right? Thank you. Other people, what was it like to be listened to for 2 minutes? Yeah.
It was different because it's rare to have someone who you're aware that their attention is completely on you.
Right.
You can look in their eyes and know that they're not thinking about where they need to be next or something going on at home.
Right.
They're not fiddling with anything. They're just totally focused on you. That's
Right.
really rare.
It is really rare. Well said. Incredibly, ridiculously rare, I will say. Thank you. Maybe one or two other people about what was it like to be listened to without interruption.
It was a very long time, 2 minutes. I ran out of things to say and then I kind of circled back, but it let me make some connections that I don't normally make.
Great, okay. Many, many people will feel uncomfortable being listened to and being focused on, like you said. Some people love it, say, oh my goodness, finally, right? I've waited 55 years for somebody to, shut up for 2 minutes, right? So I hear this from people, right? In my home, nobody, and so forth. For other people, it's super uncomfortable, either because they're used to listening to other people and not having the attention on them, or because, like you say, they feel like, I don't know if I have anything to say, or, what do I have to say here that other people should be listening to? What I find is fairly quickly, when people get used to this, you cannot shut them up. And people become competitive almost for their time. And, if you only give them 5 minutes instead of 10 minutes, they really wish they were getting the 10 minutes, okay? But it takes some getting used to if you're not used to it. Okay, so thank you for the feedback. As I mentioned to the faculty yesterday, if there are only 2 strategies that I hope to leave people with around these issues, this is one of them. And we can get better and better at doing it. You do have to practice it and so forth and so on. It is deceptively simple, as I mentioned. Some of the assets or the advantages or the benefits of this exercise. One is that everybody is heard. So say you're in a large group of people and you're about to tackle an issue to do with the ways in which water in your springs is being handled. I know there's commercial enterprises that are involved in the water in your springs, and there's controversy around it. Say you were engaging with your community on that topic. In a 5-minute span, everybody in the room would have been heard by at least one other person. Got 500 people in the room, all those people have been heard by at least one other person, right? That's a big deal. And as somebody who facilitates a lot of difficult dialogues, it's a huge deal. Because if people come into the room and aren't heard, they often feel isolated, not connected to anybody in the room, which is not a good starting point for any kind of a difficult dialogue. And the other piece is that if they haven't been heard, they will ensure that they are in the broader conversation, right? And sometimes people have built up not being heard for a very long time about certain issues or about everything. And as I mentioned yesterday, there are entire groups of people who may not really have been heard for maybe 400 years, right? So being heard is huge, right? And that applies to your relationship to your sister. It applies to your relationship with your father-in-law. It applies to your relationship with your colleagues. It applies to global peace between, Israel and Palestine. There was a project I'm familiar with in Israel and Palestine where people went over there, and what they did was they spent time listening to folks from Israel for, I forget how they did it, half an hour at a time, and then folks from Palestine, and then folks from Israel, and then folks from Palestine. And they went on like this for a number of days until both teams, so to speak, felt they had been heard. So they then were able to begin to open up to the possibility of hearing the other people, right? Which is when stuff started to happen, okay? So everybody getting heard is a big deal. And one of the best things I can recommend to you if you are in any kind of a romantic partnership or marriage is that this is how you conduct your fights. And I'm not kidding. So you set your timer, and the other person gets 5 minutes to say whatever he or she has to say or about who's not doing the dishes. And then you listen with no comment, no interruption, no judgments, no corrections. And then their time is up, and they get to listen to you for 5 minutes. And after a couple rounds of this, people actually start to listen to the other person. But they don't start there, right? Completely in their own viewpoint, right? So by the time you do a couple rounds of this, humans begin to feel satisfied that someone has heard what they're trying to say, and now maybe I can consider the possibility that you might have a shred of a possibility in some remote universe of something worth listening to as well. So everybody getting heard is a big deal, and I'll notch something I gotta remember to come back to. Equal time is a huge deal. Again, if there's anything I would put out into the world in terms of if you get together to have a dialogue about anything, or you're discussing a community issue that is upsetting to many people, or you're talking about, again, who's doing the house cleaning in your residential hall, or whatever you're doing, right, is that everybody get equal time. Nothing wipes out relationships more than somebody dominating the airtime, right? It just doesn't work if somebody is perpetually over-talking and other people are silenced in the presence of that. It is an extraordinarily common thing on the private level, but also on the global level. The US, for example, dominates the airspace in many, many, many settings, right? So ensuring equal time is huge, and you can do that anywhere. You're in your family car and you're driving somewhere and you say, okay, how did everybody, what's been going on in your day today? Okay, Jonathan, what's happened in your day today? Blah, 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 blah. Okay, thank you very much. Sally, what's going on in your day today? Blah, 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 blah. Jonathan, excuse me, Sally's turn. Could you let Sally speak? Sally, blah, blah, blah. Jonathan, excuse me, wait a minute, hang on, let Sally speak, right? And you go around the dinner table, you go around the family holiday experience, you do it on the phone with your in-laws or whatever, right? Where you just suggest to people or your colleagues, hey, can you listen to me for 3 minutes? I'll do the same for you, right? Or let me listen to you for 3 minutes. I won't say anything while you do that so you can get your thinking together. Then could you do the same for me? Okay? Huge difference in shift in terms of what the quality then of the dialogue is that you have than if you hadn't done something like this. Lets people organize their thoughts. If you do, again, controversial issues, people will come staggering into them with whatever they got going on, right? Or many people won't know what they think, or they don't feel confident speaking in the group, right? For personal reasons, cultural reasons, whatever, right? So if they're allowed to get into a small pair, like we just did, many people then can use that to say, what do I think about this? Or would I be willing, like I, who am used to performing, I'm used to doing all the things that I do publicly, when I get to testify, I become completely terrified. Legislative testifying sends me for some reason. And so for me to be able to get with somebody and say, hey, could you just listen to me for 2 minutes before I have to go say something publicly in a testimonial situation, helps me figure out what am I doing again? What was it I was going to say? It helps people process their emotions. Difficult dialogues are difficult because there's something high emotional at stake, right? So people get to have 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 1 minute to have their feelings, so to speak, in private without then lobbing them necessarily into the wider discussion, which is what people do, right? They'll come in, and if they don't get heard, they come into the bigger dialogue and they get heard. They ensure that they get heard, right? So this sort of lets people kind of have a place to process some of that before they engage in the wider discussion. And then, as I said to the faculty, it also lets facilitators like me have a timeout. When if I don't know what I'm doing, I will say to people, go into listening pairs. And then I will take that time to figure out what I'm doing, right? So think about that for a minute. Just take a moment, maybe actually turn to somebody near you. How might you use something like that in your own context? Everybody here is in a different situation. The mayor, I think, may have had to go, but I thought about assembly meetings. I know, like I said, my family is very political, that there are many public situations that would be incredibly helped by dropping these in every 20 minutes or so as we're discussing a hot topic, the monument discussion that just happened in this town, right? Confederate monument. This would have been a perfect one to just drop in listening pairs all the way through those discussions. And for those of you who speak in public, as I told the faculty, the data seems to suggest that it used to be people could listen for about 20 minutes, taking in new information before they stopped listening to you, unless they got a chance to process and link what you were saying to their own lives. That figure has dropped, it appears, probably due to technology. So if you don't give people a chance to process what you're saying somehow, they're bailing on you, right? So this gives people a chance to think, okay, what did we just do? How does that link to my own life so that I stay with what we're talking about? So find somebody, I'll give you like a minute apiece, and just think out loud with them about how you might use this in your own context. Find somebody new. The question is just, did anybody have any thoughts about how they might use this in their own contexts, whatever environments you're operating in? Yeah.
I had thought about being at the Women's March a couple weekends ago, and due to this sign I was carrying, some other women came up and they wanted me to go over and talk to the man who was protesting against Planned Parenthood.
Mm-hmm.
And I declined because I just wasn't in the mood, but I was thinking that would be
Perfect.
a perfect time.
Perfect.
To have
I have done that many times, and on the strength of doing that once, many years later, I was invited to facilitate a major difficult dialogue between pro-choice and pro-life people in my town because they'd never seen anybody do it before. Right? Just come up and respectfully invite them to share with me what they were thinking and hold the space for it, whether I agreed with it or not. It was pretty radical. Great idea. That's a great idea. Another one? Yeah.
I really like the emphasis of allowing someone else to speak first and uninterrupted. And now I have a hard time holding back cues. You know, I'm nodding that I not necessarily agree, but that I understand the community.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And I think personally, I need to remind myself to give someone else a chance to speak, perhaps first, to, as you suggested, allow them to feel that they have been heard, and then maybe that would put them in a better
Gotcha.
position.
Yeah. Got it. Okay, great. What a great insight. Wonderful. Maybe one more thought? Yeah.
Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
If I'm at the meeting that you're facilitating on abortion rights or whatever,
Yeah.
and we break out into groups, and I'm talking to an individual, and so she hears me.
Yeah.
But I want the group to hear.
Yeah.
How do you produce it?
Gotcha.
How do we feel that my
Yeah. Your vote. Yeah. Sure. No. Great question. I use this as a preparation for the group conversation, not as a replacement for it. So I would do this before we talked together, and then invite people to have a conversation. You know, and we're doing the next thing will be critical to the conversation we'd have. But so this would be a way of allowing you to organize your thoughts to present, to maybe clear off some high emotion before you present, to do all these things, and then to go ahead and say what you said to the group. Yeah, great. Yeah.
I don't know if you want to go here, but I'll harken back to the protest scenario.
Yeah, sure.
And let's say you do decide to listen to this person.
Yeah.
And they are spewing hatred and
Right.
irrationality. Respond to that.
Yeah. It takes a lot of work to be good at this at that level. We need more people who can be good at that level, to not take personally other people's emotional distress as they are displaying it that way. I operate from the premise that human beings are inherently good and that people are treating me the way that they were treated. And so I have listened to many things that are bone-chilling, right? On the premise that you can't argue someone out of their position, but you can often listen them out of it. There are any number of listening projects out there where people have started out coming from extraordinarily racist viewpoints, for example, and by being listened to repeatedly and over by teams of listeners, they shift their own viewpoint. Okay? People often are spewing garbage because they've been injured in some way or have perceived themselves to be injured in some way. They're filled with misinformation. They're diverting all their pain in the wrong directions, yada, 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 yada. But I can tell you that preaching at them doesn't work, right? And as I said to somebody the other day, I worship at the altar of effectiveness. So it is very difficult to do that, and you have to have places where you are being heard. I have been teaching this stuff for 35 years. I have people I can call on the phone and say, hey, you got 5 minutes for me? And they'll say yes, and we each get 5 minutes, and sometimes it'll be an hour, so that I can go back and say, oh my goodness, do you really want to know what I just had to field? Right? And have my own feelings about it, go through my own getting heard about it, so that I can come back out and be available to do that work. But I wouldn't encourage people to do it who will take it personally, right? Don't make yourself a target. I mean, I certainly don't encourage people to do that if they are in the targeted group about whom these people are spewing, right? Unless people choose to. But there are entire listening groups that are built and training people to be able to do this as a way of helping people move out of those places. Yeah.
I like your term listening group.
Mm-hmm.
In my current place of life, I'm a psychotherapist.
Okay, so you know all about listening.
And burnout.
Yeah.
And what flashed into my mind is, while there's different strategies telling us how to handle burnout, I don't think I've ever heard anybody say, why don't a group of you form a listening group?
Cool. Yeah. I wouldn't be able to do what I do in the world if I didn't know there were places I could go where other people would hear me. I go fall into tears. I can go rant somewhere. I can go be afraid of the risk I just took and how it did or didn't go well, because someone's going to hear my experience, and then I can move on, right? And you know, we're in some pretty gnarly times these days. So I think setting up those kinds of supports, whether it's just a one-on-one buddy, you know, you walk out of here and say, hey, this really worked well. You want to be my listening buddy? Let's try to set something up every week, and we'll get together, and I'll listen to you for 15 minutes, and you listen to me, and we'll call it good, and see you next week, right? Or you set up a group, and so on. Okay, and maybe one more comment on this? Yeah.
Well, it's a question.
Okay.
In order to be able to talk, a person has to be able to find their voice.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that some people have not been allowed to speak for hundreds of years, perhaps like a group of people
Yes.
that are impressed.
Yes.
So how would you assist someone to make the transition from being in that place of depression and not being in touch with their own voice to being able to speak?
That's a great question. I guess I would go gently into it. You know, if you start with somebody and say, let's trade a minute, and you don't have to say anything. I mean, I've sat with people before where during their minute, I sit next to them and nudge up against them. And we just sit there together, right? And that's great. It's good enough for me. That's, you know, we're together. And then maybe the next time they say, things aren't going well with my son. And that's it. And that's good enough. I don't have to have an agenda on this, right? I'm not listening for my agenda, right? I'm listening for them to do whatever they need to do. And so over time, people begin to realize, oh, there's actually space here. Oh, there's no judgment here. Oh, I can say something stupid, right? Because nobody's interrupting me, nobody's commenting, nobody's doing it. And so people gradually begin to get a chance to feel around in there and maybe find where they're going. Yeah, welcome. Okay, I'm going to shift to we may only have time for 2 strategies, but that's okay, because this is the second one that is most important in this context. This is creating guidelines for a discussion. So as obvious as that sounds, my experience is that we almost never do it, right? So we are talking about difficult things, not just talking about, isn't the weather here in Gainesville a lot better than in my town? So you know going in that the chances are it's going to be challenging, right? So why not set up at the beginning some sorts of agreements for how we're going to treat each other during this discussion? And it can range from something as brief as, I'd like to bring up the issue of where we're going on vacation this year. And what I don't want to have happen is to have you rush out and slam the door like we did last time when I mentioned that I'd like to go and see my mother. And what I do want to have happen is that both of us end up feeling okay about where we go or how the vacation is handled. That can be guidelines for a discussion. You just put parameters on it. Here's what I don't want to have happen, and here's what I do want to have happen, okay? Or you can say, let's talk about the comment you made at the Thanksgiving dinner, because I have some things I'd like to share about that. Here's what I hope happens. You know, I really don't want you to accuse me of being bossy and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And I promise that I will listen to what you have to say without making sarcastic remarks. Okay? I mean, that's the level most of us are at with a lot of these things, right? What do you need before we go into this discussion? Tell me what your, guidelines for discussion would be for us to have this conversation. Right? So we can do it at that level. When I do it on the public level, I do it in a more organized fashion, which we will do a tiny abridged version of right now. And this is based on students, but we can apply it to any other group, right? So, maybe I changed the words, look at that. So we get into groups of 3 or 5, and I'm going to have you do it incredibly briefly. And we come up with 2 lists. If we were about to launch into a discussion of a very challenging topic in this town, here, now, what do you want people to do? What behaviors do you want them to display in this conversation that will make it go well? And what do you not want them to do? What might they do that would torque, sort of send the discussion south from your standpoint? That's a terrible phrase, isn't it? Now that I think about it. I'll have to revisit where that came from. Pull that one back in. Anyway, so you come up with 2 lists, right? What you want people to do, what you don't want them to do, behaviorally, to make a conversation go well, and then we share them out. So again, we would usually do this in groups of 3 to 5. I think I'll just put you in groups of maybe 2, just turn to somebody near you, think about that, and then we'll come back together. I'll give you like 2 minutes to do this. And you don't have to do it in turn. Just make sure each of you gets to say something, okay? Find somebody. Folks, what are the kinds of behaviors that you want people to display to make a conversation go well? And let me tell you, every group is different on this, right? So it's specific to who's in this room if we were to have this conversation together.
Well, one thing we have is listen as best that they can with an open mind.
Great. Listen as best as you can with an open mind, okay? Other thoughts? Yeah.
We suggested encouraging eye contact.
Encouraging eye contact. Okay, great. So if I were doing this formally, I'd be writing this up on the wall, right? What else? Yeah.
Asking questions to show they're engaged, not interrupting me, but just to show that what I'm saying isn't just going over there.
Okay, so asking questions to show you're engaged, not interrupting, but just asking questions to indicate that what's being said isn't just going over your head, you're getting it. Great, okay. Yeah.
Paying attention, really paying attention, not fiddling with my phone or my shoes.
Yeah, okay, really paying attention, not fiddling with other things or being distracted in some way. Great. Please.
Being able to reflect on what was just said to me so that I know that you have heard me and you understand what I said.
Okay. Being able to reflect on what you just said, I think you can hear. That's a form of, in many ways, what people call active listening, where you make sure that the person, you say back to them something about what they said so that they feel like you got it. And if you didn't, they get a chance to say, no, actually, It's not what I meant, or that isn't what I said. This is what I meant. Thank you. Okay? Yeah. Permission to make a mistake. Great. Okay. That's a great one.
Being sensitive to tendencies to dominate.
Yes. Okay, being sensitive to a tendency to dominate. So be mindful of how much airspace you're taking. Okay. So you get, yeah, go ahead.
You don't make assumptions about what you think your partner is going to say.
Yeah.
So that you're not really listening to what they're saying.
Got it. I have been known to fill in other people's sentences at the end. It's true, right? With impatience. And 90% of the time I'm wrong about what they were going to say. It's really true. Great. Okay, so you get the sense of how this goes, right? How about some of the things you don't want people to do? Yeah.
No physical violence.
No physical violence. I'm with you on that. Tends to have this weird dampening effect on dialogue, you know? Good one. That is out. And in public spaces, that can be a big deal. Even these days. I mean, I've been in situations where we have security around when we're having our dialogue for that reason. Okay? So that can be important. Other don't wants, yeah.
Keep the emotions in check. I've known people who would raise a point without raising their voice.
Okay. All right. So just so you know, that one I'm flagging. There was one about eye contact. There's a couple other ones. Are good examples of ones where we would then dig deeper, right? Because we get to talk about these. So some people, most people that I've experienced in these contexts would agree with that viewpoint that you were just saying, right? But there are some people for whom engagement looks like this. I'm very engaged, I'm passionately engaged, I'm gonna get in there with you, and if I don't do it like this, I'm not engaging, right? And there are whole cultures like that. So it depends on where you are, and it depends on who's in the room, right? So somebody would have the right to say, well, that doesn't quite work for me, I can't do that. The example that I was saying to them yesterday is I have a deep sort of street background. Doesn't look like it to look at me. I know that. Street, yeah, we grew up pretty, yeah. So when I get passionate, I swear. And I have to work super hard not to do that if I'm really in an emotional state, okay? So most people find that offensive, or will say in a thing like this, don't swear, right? And for many people that makes complete sense, that that's just rude, and why would you do that, right? But I might have to say, hey, please forgive me, I will try to do that. But you wouldn't have thought so, looking at me, right? And that's true for everybody, right? You can't tell by looking at anybody. We just can't. What's up with them and where they come from? You just can't. So we would talk about it, right? Where I come from, as I mentioned before, there are indigenous nations where looking directly at somebody is disrespectful in certain contexts, right? So it's possible that in my context, if somebody said, look, make eye contact, somebody might, or I might on their behalf, raise the possibility that for some people, that might not be what makes sense. And we would talk about that, right? So I'm gonna put a lid on it here just because of time, but I really strongly encourage you to think about all the contexts that you operate in and how we might invite each other to share these kinds of requests, at least, before we engage in a dialogue. It can even be in a family, of course, right? Again, we're going to talk tonight about XYZ. Before we do, what does everybody want to say about how we interact? And someone will say, well, Dad, I don't want you to yell at me. You know, and Dad gets to say, well, you know, I'd really appreciate it if you weren't texting every time I'm speaking to you. Right? And somebody else gets to say blah, 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 whatever they say, right? And it really changes the game because then people feel like they've made the guidelines and then you kind of have to agree on what you do if people refuse to abide by them, even though you've made them, right? And that can vary wildly as well, right? But my experience has been that if you even attempt this, even at that initial level that I said of I don't want this to happen and I do want that to happen, Or before we start, we only have a few minutes, but let me ask you, I think somebody in here mentioned it sort of, let's try to listen to understand rather than listen to react or to win or to, right? And speak to be understood. Try to speak in a way where the intention of what you're trying to do is to help other people understand you, not just to make your point. You could say things like that. You can say, could you please just make sure you speak for yourself, right? Don't bring in, everybody knows that this is true. Actually, it's you that know or think that that is true. Please, I always say when I introduce public things, obviously no name calling, no slurs. I won't let that happen. So if that happens, I'm going to intervene. Just FYI, everybody in agreement, right? Sometimes I get people to raise their hands. Everybody good with what we just said? And now publicly they've committed in. So just again for time, why don't you take one more minute, either find somebody new or not somebody new. Think about how you might use this in your context. Right. Well, I mean, if, for example, if the group says, please don't interrupt, and one member perpetually interrupts, or if they say, we need you to come on time to start, and somebody never comes on time, right? What usually people agree on is that someone will pull that person aside privately first to check in and say, hey, remember we all agreed we were going to do X, Y, Z. It doesn't look like that's working out for you. Is there something happening that we could speak to that would help you get there, right? And sometimes people can make the shift. They sort of come out of their oblivion and realize, oh, I could leave 15 minutes early. I just never do because nobody ever says anything to me. And sorry. And sometimes people say, I said I would, but the truth is my child has a disability and I cannot seem to get her, into the car as quickly as I thought, and I'm horribly sorry. And then you share that with the group and they say, fine, come whenever you need to, right? Sometimes people cannot do it, right? There are people who, no matter how many times I say, please don't dominate the airspace, dominate the airspace. So then the group might agree to time things, which I'm a huge fan of, not relying on human fallibility to monitor itself. So they might agree that that's the way we're going to handle it. And I was thinking about it yesterday because we have, that there are kindly ways we can help people so that if the beeper goes off and you're done, but you keep talking, then someone will play the harmonica shortly afterwards. And if you continue to talk, right, we will all leap, up into the air and begin Zumba dancing shortly, right? And if so that, people are given a shot at it, right, in a way that's not horrifying to them to discover that they have an ingrained pattern that is very difficult to change. But they're also not allowed to do it because, again, it will ruin your conversation if somebody refuses to go by the agreements of the group. So many times people, eventually after they've tried other interventions, they invite people not to come. And the person then has the option of either they can pull it off where their behavior matches what the group needs for the conversation to work, or nobody has to shame them. They just can't do it, and they are disinvited. So it gets that far, right? Okay, well, I think we are at time. So unless there's other questions, I hope you get to walk away with at least some things to think about in terms of two, the most basic to my mind, foundational strategies for improving your conversations with other human beings. Thank you for coming.